What follows is the complete account of the cleared line. All chapters have been compiled into a single uninterrupted story for your listening experience. So dim the lights, settle in, and enjoy. This is Killer Prompt.
Chapter 1. The Gap. The real estate listing described the house as secluded but not isolated, which felt to me like careful reassurance. It suggested privacy without risk, distance without disconnection. Only later did I understand that it was the kind of phrasing designed to make something sound balanced when it wasn't, an attempt to soften an edge that can't be removed. At the time, though, it sounded like exactly what I needed. The town of Marrow Creek hadn't felt remarkable in any obvious way. I had passed through it slowly, following the main road as it bent between low buildings and faded storefronts that seemed to exist more out of habit than necessity. Nothing stood out enough to hold my attention, and yet I found myself easing off the gas as I drove, as though the place required it. There was movement, someone crossing the street, a truck idling near an intersection, but it all felt measured, contained within a rhythm I didn't quite understand. No one looked directly at me, or if they did, it was brief enough to be dismissible, the kind of glance that doesn't invite acknowledgement. Still, I had the faint impression that my presence had been noted in a way that didn't rely on eye contact, as if the town had a way of registering arrivals without needing to show it. By the time I passed the last building and the road began to climb, I found myself exhaling without realizing I had been holding my breath. As I drove higher into the mountains, the trees grew thick and close together, rising in uneven layers that blocked out the long stretches of sky. The farther I drove, the more the world behind me seemed to lose definition. The road narrowed gradually, but it felt more like protection than confinement. The house revealed itself as the driveway curved inward, gravel shifting under the tires before giving way to packed earth. It was larger than I expected. 2 stories, dark siding, a wraparound porch that faced nothing but trees on all 4 sides. The windows reflected the forest so completely that for a moment it looked as though the structure had been absorbed into it rather than placed there. I sat in the car for a while after parking, hands still resting on the steering wheel, waiting for the hesitation that usually followed decisions like this. It had always come before, in one form or another, a flicker of doubt, a question about whether I had overlooked something important. This time it didn't. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the quiet. It had a weight to it, a kind of presence that filled space without pressing against it. Wind moved through the pine needles in slow, measured passes, and the trees responded with a low, patient creaking that felt less like movement and more like adjustment. Somewhere deeper in the forest, water moved over a rock in steady, unbroken rhythm. I didn't realize how much I was bracing for the noise of the city until it had vanished. Nothing demanded my attention. Nothing insisted on being acknowledged. It was the kind of quiet that allowed you to exist without explanation. There were no visible neighbors. Not to either side, not across the road. Just uninterrupted woodland stretching outward in every direction, dense enough that it felt less like ownership and more like temporary permission to occupy the space that had long existed before me. No unexpected visitors, no casual observation, no one watching the driveway to see when I left or returned, no one noticing if I stayed inside longer than I should. For the first time in a long time, I felt unobserved. Not unseen, that wasn't the same thing. It was more specific than that. It felt as though whatever quiet accounting had been following me, tracking choices, missteps, presence, had simply stopped. It wasn't until I was reviewing the closing paperwork later that I noticed a single detail that would stay with me until long after everything else had faded. Adjacent rear property, privately owned. At the time, it barely registered. Out here, that was expected. Privacy wasn't unusual, it was the baseline. People came to places like this specifically to avoid proximity, to exist without being seen or measured by anyone else. I didn't question it. I knew the feeling. The first week passed in the way new environments often do, where time stretches and compresses unpredictably. I woke earlier than I intended, not because of noise, but because of its absence. Without traffic or artificial light, my sense of time shifted to match the natural rhythm around me. By mid-morning, I was outside working. The previous owners had left behind the remnants of a garden near the back of the house. Raised beds edged with weathered wood, the soil overgrown but still viable beneath the surface. I cleared it slowly, turning the earth, pulling roots free, rebuilding something that followed simple rules. Plant, water, wait. Growth or failure, cause and effect, without ambiguity. It felt grounding in a way I hadn't expected. Predictable, reliable. I began to spend most of my time outside, moving between the garden beds and the porch, letting the day settle around me without interruption. By evening, the forest would begin its gradual shift into shadow, the upper branches catching the last of the light while the ground level darkened first. Even then, the quiet remained steady, unbroken. I didn't feel alone out there. I felt contained. The brush line behind the property became the natural boundary of that feeling. It stood about 50 yards out, a dense, tangled wall of blackberry brambles, saplings, and fallen limbs woven together over time. It was thick enough to block light in places, creating a visual barrier that felt complete. I came to think of it as the edge of my world. Not something threatening, but something defined. A limit I didn't need to question. The first sound came on the 9th day. I remember the exact moment because it didn't interrupt anything. It slipped into the space between actions, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it entirely. I was standing at the kitchen sink, hands in warm water, looking out toward the tree line without really focusing on it. At first, I thought the sound came from inside the house. A thin, metallic note, sharp enough to startle but distinct enough to feel out of place. I shut off the faucet and stood still. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the low, ambient noise of the house settling. Pipes cooling, wood adjusting, the faint hum of appliances. I waited, expecting it to repeat. When it did, it came from outside. A dull, hollow clang followed by a dragging scrape that lingered longer than the initial impact. The rhythm was irregular, but not random. Each pause placed just slightly too evenly to feel accidental. I stepped onto the porch without turning on the light. The forest had already begun to lose definition, the trees blending into a single dark mass as the last of the daylight faded. The brush line stood where it always had, unbroken, still. Then the sound came again. Closer or clearer, I couldn't tell which. The mountains distorted distance, bending sound in ways that made it difficult to locate its origin precisely. It could have been just beyond the barrier. It could have been farther back, carried forward by the terrain. "Hello?" I called out, before I had fully decided to speak. The word disappeared into the trees without echo. For a moment, the forest felt suspended, as if it were waiting for something else to follow. Then there was movement by the brush line. Not the sound of something leaving, something shifting its weight. Remaining. I went back inside and locked the door without really thinking about it. The motion felt automatic, a response to something I couldn't yet define. The whole house felt different afterward, altered in a way that was difficult to articulate. The rooms seemed slightly larger, as though the space between walls had stretched while I wasn't paying attention. I told myself it was just the quiet. That night, I slept badly. By morning, it was there. At first, it didn't register as a change. I stood at the kitchen sink and stared out the window, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered, smoothing over the difference as if it were a trick of perspective or memory. It wasn't until I stepped outside and looked directly at the brush line that the inconsistency became impossible to ignore. A narrow opening had appeared. I walked toward it slowly, aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere as I approached. The closer I got, the quieter the forest became. Not silent, but muted, as though sound itself had been dampened in that space. I stopped a few feet from the opening. Up close, the detail became clearer. Vines had been severed cleanly, saplings cut at angles too precise to be accidental. There was no debris, no sign of removal, just absence, where there had once been density. Not wide enough to be immediately obvious, but clean enough that it stood out once I focused on it. The tangled growth had been cut back with a level of precision that didn't match anything I associated with natural damage. The edges weren't broken or splintered, they were defined. It looked like something had been removed deliberately, with control. There was a smell there. Like fresh vegetation cut recently, layered over something else that didn't quite belong. It wasn't chemical in any obvious sense, but it carried a faint sterility that felt out of place in the middle of the woods. I considered stepping through the gap. The thought came and held there, not accompanied by fear so much as a distinct sense that doing so would matter in a way I couldn't define. Not physically, but in some other sense, as if crossing that line would register somewhere beyond the immediate environment. I didn't test it. I went back to the house, closed the back door, and locked it again, even though the day was warm enough that I would have left it open before. Over the next few days, the changes continued. They were small at first, subtle enough that I could question my own perception. The opening widened incrementally, the edges extending outward in clean, deliberate lines. The light behind the house began to shift as well, reaching farther into the yard than it had before, illuminating areas that had previously remained in shadow. I walked along the brush line and left markers at the edge of the gap. Small, unobtrusive indicators. A stone placed near the boundary, a twig set upright in the soil, a strip of tape tied loosely around a thin trunk. The markers were meant to confirm what I thought I was seeing, to provide a fixed reference point. By the next morning, they had all moved. Not far, just enough to make it clear they were no longer where I had placed them. The tape lay on the ground several feet closer to the house. The tree it had been tied to was gone entirely. The knot remained intact. I stopped marking the changes after that, not because it didn't work, but because it did. The house began to feel different in ways that were harder to track. A door left slightly ajar when I was certain I had closed it. A chair angled differently than I remembered. The sense that the interior space was no longer entirely neutral, but participating in something I didn't yet understand. One afternoon, standing at the window, I felt it clearly for the first time. Not a sound, not a movement, just the distinct awareness of being observed. It was focused, directed, and immediate in a way that bypassed logic entirely, the kind of certainty that arrives before you have time to question it. I turned toward the glass, expecting to see something, someone, a shape, any indication that the feeling had a source. There was nothing. Just the clearing, the trees beyond it, and the shifting patterns of light filtering through the canopy. And yet, the longer I looked, the more the shapes seemed to resist staying what they were. Branches suggested outlines that almost resolved into something recognizable before collapsing back into randomness. The depth felt unreliable, as though the space between foreground and background wasn't fixed. I stepped back from the window, forcing myself to break the line of sight. That night, I woke with the quiet certainty that something had moved inside the house. Not dramatically, not enough to produce a sound, just enough to be different. In the morning, everything appeared as it should have, except the back door. Still closed, still locked, but the screen door behind it sat slightly unlatched. I stood at the kitchen sink later that day staring out at the clearing, trying to decide whether I was misreading what I was seeing or whether the environment itself was adjusting in ways I hadn't accounted for. That was when I noticed the light. A small, steady point of red in the distance. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It simply existed at a height and position that felt deliberate. I turned immediately, scanning the house behind me, looking for a reflection, a source, anything that might explain it. There was nothing. When I looked back, the light was gone. A moment later, my phone vibrated on the counter. I turned toward it automatically, still thinking about the clearing, about the light, about the way the space had begun to feel structured rather than natural. The notification was simple. Unknown device detected nearby. Chapter 2. The Record. I didn't go into town because I needed anything. That was the first thing I was aware of as I drove down the mountain the next morning. There was no list, no practical reason for leaving the house behind. The refrigerator was stocked. The supplies I had brought with me were more than enough, and nothing in the past week had suggested I was missing anything essential. What I needed wasn't something I could buy. It was context. There's a particular kind of distortion that comes with isolation. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of reference. Without other people, without casual confirmation of what is normal, the smallest inconsistencies begin to expand. Not because they change, but because there's nothing to measure them against. Left alone long enough, even certainty begins to feel provisional. The road down felt shorter than the drive up had been, though I couldn't say why. The same turns, the same narrow stretches of asphalt threading between trees. The same gradual reintroduction of signs and structures that indicated proximity to something shared. The town itself sat at the base of the mountain in a way that suggested it had settled there over time rather than being built with intention. Nothing stood out. Nothing demanded attention. I parked along the main road and remained in the car for a moment longer than necessary, watching the movement, or lack of it, around me. A few people crossed the street in the distance. A truck idled near an intersection before turning out of view. No one looked toward me. No one paused. No one tracked the arrival of someone new in a place that seemed small enough for that to matter. The library was easy to find. It sat slightly apart from the other buildings, set back from the road behind a narrow strip of grass that had been worn down in irregular paths. The structure itself was brick, its windows tall but narrow, allowing in light without offering much of a view back out. A wooden sign hung near the entrance, its lettering softened by the repeated painting. Inside, the air was cooler, dry, preserved. The smell of paper dominated everything else. Not unpleasant, but distinct, carrying the sense that what existed here had been kept deliberately, maintained against the slow erosion of time. There was only one person inside. She sat behind a desk near the entrance, a book open in front of her, her posture relaxed but not inattentive. When the door closed behind me, she looked up, not startled, not curious, simply aware that something had changed in the room.
"Can I help you?"
she asked. Her voice didn't carry any particular inflection. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't unfriendly either. It felt measured, as though it occupied a very specific place between engagement and distance. "I just moved up the mountain," I said. "I was hoping to find something on the area, local history maybe, property records." She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the silence between question and response stretching just enough to be noticeable without becoming uncomfortable. Then she nodded once.
"Back room,"
she said.
"Through the stacks, left side."
That was all. No follow-up question about where I had moved or how long I planned to stay. No casual interest that might have anchored the interaction into something familiar. Just direction. I moved through the shelves slowly, aware of the way the space absorbed sound. The main room was organized, curated, and each section clearly labeled and maintained. The back room was different. The transition was subtle but distinct. The lighting dimmed slightly. The shelves shifted from uniform rows to something more irregular, metal instead of wood. The organization was looser, less concerned with presentation. Boxes were stacked along the walls, some labeled in careful handwriting, others marked quickly, the ink uneven. This wasn't the part of the library meant to be seen. This is where things were kept. I started with the property maps. They were stored in flat drawers, layered between sheets of protective paper that had yellowed at the edges. When I slid one free and laid it out on the table, the first thing I noticed was how precise the lines were. Parcel boundaries drawn in ink, measured and deliberate, each section labeled with names that had either been crossed out or replaced over time. The road to my house appeared consistently. The structure itself did as well, marked in the same position across different years, its footprint unchanged. But the land behind it didn't. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't have been noticeable without comparison. But as I placed one map beside another, aligning the edges, I began to see it. The tree line moved. Not outward in a natural way, not with the uneven expansion of growth, but in small, deliberate adjustments. A section that had once been marked as dense brush was later drawn back, its boundary straighter. Another map labeled that same area differently, as restricted access, written in small print near the edge. There were no notes explaining the change. No indication of why the designation had been altered. Just the revision. I put the maps back and moved on. The next set of records was less formal. Local incident reports, organized by date but not by type. Most were exactly what I expected. Weather damage, minor accidents, missing property that was later recovered. The kind of documentation that exists to record events, not to interpret them. But every so often, something broke the pattern. I paused over one entry. October 14th, 1987. Unconfirmed report of lights observed within restricted tree line. Witness describes vertical movement inconsistent with known equipment. No follow-up. The language was precise but contained. It didn't dismiss the observation, but it didn't pursue it either. It acknowledged the event just enough to justify its existence, then closed without resolution. Further down, another entry. May 3rd, 1992. Survey team reports interference with measuring equipment. Compass deviation recorded across fixed line approximately 40 yards in length. Area later redrawn in updated map. I read that one twice, then glanced back toward the maps I had just replaced. 40 yards. Approximately the distance from my house to the brush line. I continued. August 22nd, 2004. Resident complaint. Trees appear altered overnight. No physical evidence found upon inspection. Report closed. I stopped there for a moment, the phrasing settling into something more familiar than it should have been. Altered. Not damaged. Not removed. Altered. The reports continued in that same tone, observations recorded without interpretation. Events acknowledged without escalation. Each one suggested that something had been noticed, but none suggested that anything had been done. Deeper in the collection, the records changed again. Older material, newspaper clippings, personal notes, fragments that hadn't been formally cataloged. One article had been folded so many times that the crease had begun to split the paper. Local property dispute escalates. Private landowner denies access to surveyors. Claims environmental instability in rear acreage. Officials decline to comment. There were no names. The story simply ended. I set it aside and opened another folder. This one contained handwritten notes. Not official, not standardized. Observations. Different handwriting, different ink, but the same underlying tone. Measured, restrained, careful not to overstate. Sound carries incorrectly past second line. Light behaves differently after clearing. Depth perception unreliable beyond marked boundary. I read them slowly, aware of the way each statement aligned with something I had already experienced, though none of them described it directly. One note, written more carefully than the others, had been underlined. Not heavily, but for preservation. Do not rely on visual confirmation once the barrier is compromised. I leaned back slightly, the chair shifting against the floor in a way that felt louder than it should have. For the first time since entering the room, I became aware of the space around me again. Not visually, but in the way you become aware of silence when it changes. I wasn't alone. Not in any physical sense, There was no movement, no sound beyond the quiet settling of the building, but the room felt attentive. I looked toward the doorway. It was empty. The shelves were unchanged, the air remained still and cool, and yet the awareness did not fade. I turned back to the notes, flipping the page forward. The ink was darker. Not fresh exactly, but not faded in the way the others were. The handwriting was different, cleaner, more deliberate, and the line was short. Subject demonstrates pattern recognition earlier than expected. I stared at it. Not because I didn't understand what it said, but because I couldn't place when it had been written. There was no date, no name, no context that anchored it to the rest of the material. I flipped back a page and then forward again. The line was gone. The page contained older notes, faded ink, familiar handwriting, nothing out of place. I remained still for a moment, waiting for the sensation to pass. It didn't. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place, aligning it with the others as though the act of restoring order might extend beyond the physical. When I stepped back into the main room, the librarian was exactly where I had left her. Same posture, same page open in front of her. She looked up as I approached, her expression unchanged.
"Find what you're looking for?"
She asked. There was something in the phrasing that felt slightly off. Not curiosity, but like expectation. "I'm not sure yet," I said. It was the most accurate answer I could give. She nodded once, as if that was the only answer she had anticipated. As I turned to leave, she spoke again, her tone unchanged.
"Some of the older records aren't always consistent."
I paused, my hand resting on the door. "In what way?" I asked. She looked back down at her book before answering.
"In the way they present themselves,"
she said.
"You shouldn't rely on them to stay the same."
There was no elaboration, no clarification, just the statement, placed between us without emphasis. I sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine, trying to assemble what I had read into something coherent. Property lines that shifted without explanation, reports that acknowledged anomalies without investigating them, observations that matched my own recorded years before I arrived, and a note that hadn't existed long enough to be written. On the drive back up the mountain, I checked the rearview mirror more often than I intended to. Not because I thought I was being followed, because it felt like something should have been there. When the house came into view, the first thing I noticed was the light. It reached farther into the yard than it had that morning, stretching across the ground in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The clearing had widened again. Not enough to shock, just enough that I couldn't say with certainty where it had been before. I remained in the car for a moment watching. The trees stood still. The space between them held. Nothing moved. But the structure of it, the alignment, the depth, felt different, more defined. Inside, the house appeared unchanged. The same arrangement of furniture, the same quiet. I stepped into the kitchen and set my keys down on the counter, my attention already drifting back toward the window, toward the clearing, toward the subtle but undeniable sense that something had shifted again. And that's when I noticed the counter. A thin layer of dust where I usually left my phone had been disturbed. Not scattered, not brushed aside, but cleaned, like someone had wiped it in a circular shape. I stood there looking at it, trying to recall whether I had set anything down in that exact spot before I left, trying to reconstruct the morning in detail. Nothing came back clearly enough to confirm it. I didn't touch the mark. I didn't move closer. I simply stood there, aware of the way the quiet had settled again. Not empty, not passive, but waiting in the same way it had the night I first heard the sound beyond the brush line. That evening I closed the curtains, not out of habit, but out of recognition. Chapter 3. Recognition. By morning, I stopped trying to convince myself that what I was seeing could be explained by error. It wasn't the size of the clearing anymore that held my attention. It was the consistency of it. the way each change aligned with the last, as though the space behind the house were being adjusted according to a set of rules I hadn't been given access to. Nothing about it felt accidental. Even the smallest alteration carried intention. I stood at the edge of the yard with my coffee and watched it the way you would watch something that has already proven it doesn't behave the way it should. Not with surprise, not with curiosity alone, but with a kind of quiet assessment. The cuts were too clean. That had been true from the beginning, but it had taken time for the implication to settle into something meaningful. This wasn't clearing in the way land is usually cleared. There were no broken branches, no scattered debris, no sign of force. What had been there was simply no longer there, removed without leaving evidence of removal. Everything gone had been selected. Everything that remained had been allowed. The shape of the clearing had changed again overnight, widening in a way that no longer suggested intrusion. It didn't feel like something pushing inward. It felt like something aligning outward, extending a path that already existed, bringing the surrounding space into agreement with it. I set the mug down on the porch railing and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, aware of the fact that I had reached a point where observation alone wasn't enough. If this was a system, it wasn't passive. And if it wasn't passive, then it could be engaged. The thought didn't feel reckless. It felt appropriate. I started toward the clearing without hesitation. The shift in the air was immediate, though not dramatic. The temperature dropped slightly. The movement of wind through the trees softened, and the ambient sound of the forest seemed to compress rather than disappear. It was still there, but it felt suspended, as if it were being held just outside the space I was entering. I stopped at the edge of the opening, aware of a subtle resistance. Not physical, not something I could touch, but a distant sense that this point mattered in a way the rest of the yard did not. The note from the library resurfaced in my memory without effort. Do not rely on visual confirmation once the barrier is compromised. I considered that for a moment, then stepped forward. There was no immediate change. No sound, no sensation of crossing anything tangible. And yet the awareness came in the same way it had when I first felt watched inside the house. Not as a reaction, but as a certainty. A quiet, unmistakable shift from existing in a space to being recognized within it. I took another step, then another. The ground inside the clearing was as undisturbed as it had appeared from a distance. No tracks, no drag marks, no evidence that anything had been moved through this space. I crouched near the edge of a cut vine, studying the surface where it had been severed. Up close, the precision was even more apparent. There was no fraying, no irregularity, no indication of a blade I could identify. The edge looked sealed rather than cut, as though separation and closure had occurred simultaneously. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and touched it. The warmth was immediate. Not hot enough to cause pain, not intense enough to suggest recent cutting, but present in a way that didn't make sense. The surrounding air was cool. The ground beneath my hand carried no heat. But the surface itself held it. I pulled my hand back slowly, my attention shifting from the vine to the space around me. That's when I heard the click. It was soft, precise, and entirely out of place. I turned toward the sound, scanning the nearby trees until my eyes adjusted to what I was looking for. It took a few seconds to find it, not because it was exactly hidden, but because it didn't conform to the shape my mind was expecting. The device was mounted low on the trunk of a narrow tree, angled slightly upward. Its surface was matte, uniform, without visible seams or a defined lens, but it didn't resemble any camera I had worked with directly. And yet there was no question about what it was. Recognition came before analysis. I moved toward it slowly, watching for any sign of reaction. As I shifted position, the surface of the device adjusted. Not with mechanical movement, not with a visible pivot or rotation. The change was subtler than that. The orientation of it seemed to redefine itself, as though the concept of front existed relative to me rather than as a fixed direction. I stopped a few feet away. The device remained focused, on me. I crouched in front of it, studying it more closely, letting my position change just enough to test its behavior. It compensated immediately. Not by turning, by aligning. The distinction mattered. I reached out and placed my hand against it. The surface was cool, smooth, and completely still. There was no vibration, no indication of internal mechanics. For a moment it felt inert, as though it might not be active at all. Then the surrounding space shifted. Not visually, but perceptually. The same way a room feels when someone else becomes aware of a conversation happening inside it. I withdrew my hand and, after a brief pause, pulled the device free from the tree. It detached without resistance. No screws, no anchors, no indication that it had been fixed in any place in any permanent way. It simply came away. I stood there holding it, waiting for a response. None came. So I turned and walked back to the house. Inside, the air felt warmer, less controlled. The subtle tension that had existed in the clearing didn't follow me across the threshold, or at least not in the same form. I set the device on the kitchen table and stepped back, giving it space as though it required it. For a while, nothing happened. I moved around the room deliberately, testing the boundaries of its awareness. I turned the faucet on, then off. I crossed from one side of the kitchen to the other, changing my position, altering my movement. There was no visible reaction from the device. No adjustment. No indication that it was doing anything at all. I left the room briefly, stepping out onto the porch to retrieve my coffee, and then returned. The device had changed position. Not location, orientation. It was now angled toward the sink. I stopped in the doorway, studying it carefully, looking for any sign of how the shift had occurred. No marks on the table, no sound that I could recall, no intermediate slate that might explain the transition. It simply had been one way, and then it was another. I walked back into the room slowly, my attention fixed on the device. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's try something else." I picked up a dish towel from the counter and draped it over the device, covering it completely. The fabric settled naturally, obscuring its shape, removing any direct line of sight. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then, the towel shifted. It wasn't a dramatic movement. The fabric didn't fully lift or slide away. It rose slightly at one corner, just enough to suggest that something beneath it had altered its position, or its state. Then it settled again. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The room felt like it was listening. "Do you need to see me?" I asked. There was no verbal response, but the question lingered. I removed the towel and set it aside, then stood in front of the table and raised my hand. I waved once, slowly, deliberately. The device did not respond. It did not adjust, did not shift, did not acknowledge the gesture in any visible way. I lowered my hand. "Your turn," I said. The words were calm, almost conversational. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I stepped away, breaking the interaction, moving through the rest of the house as though the exchange had ended. I went upstairs, checked the rooms, paused in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the quiet settle around me again. When I finally came back down, the device was gone. I searched the kitchen first, then the adjacent rooms, moving through the house in a measured way that avoided the instinct to rush. Everything else remained exactly as I had left it, except the device was gone. I stopped in the living room. From that angle, the window reflected both the interior of the house and the clearing beyond it, the two spaces layered together in a way that made it difficult to separate one from the other at first glance. That was when I saw it. Outside, mounted again, not on the same tree, higher, closer to the house, and angled in a way that made its focus clear. Not where I stood, but where I would be when I stepped through the front door. I stayed there for a moment, watching it, letting the implication settle. It wasn't tracking my movement. It was anticipating it. That night I woke suddenly. The room was dark, the house quiet, the forest outside reduced to a low, distant presence. and yet something had shifted. I lay still, listening. At first there was nothing, then faintly a pattern. 3 short taps. 1 long. Short. Long. Long. Short. Long. Long. A pause followed. The sequence repeated once more, soft enough that I couldn't determine its source, only its structure. I counted it without thinking, mapped it, recognized it. The meaning surfaced automatically, drawn from a place I didn't consciously access. It had been a while since I'd used Morse code. The taps were spelling, stay. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, the clearing had widened again, not toward the forest, but toward my house. Chapter 4. Response. The change in the clearing was no longer something I could measure in feet or inches. It had shifted in character. Up to that point, every adjustment, every widening, had carried a kind of restraint. The alterations had been controlled, incremental, almost careful in the way they presented themselves. Even when they defied explanation, they did so with a pattern that suggested limits. The restraint was gone. The opening behind the house no longer read as a corridor or even an intrusion into the forest. It resolved into something broader, more deliberate, a space that no longer needed to conceal its purpose. The trees at its edges stood back in a way that felt less like clearing and more like repositioning, as though they had been arranged rather than removed. The light behaved differently within it. I noticed as I stood at the window, looking out across the yard. The sunlight didn't simply pass through the clearing, it settled into it, filling the space in a way that flattened the surrounding depth. The usual layering of distance, the subtle shifts in color and shadow that distinguished foreground from background felt diminished. Everything beyond the edge of the clearing seemed closer, or perhaps more accurately, less defined by distance at all. I stepped outside, not with the same tentative awareness I had carried the day before, but with a clearer sense of purpose. The hesitation had been replaced by something else. Not confidence exactly, but familiarity. Enough had happened now that I understood the basic structure of this interaction. Observation, response, adjustment. What I didn't yet understand was the extent of it. I walked toward the clearing at a measured pace, paying attention not just to what I could see, but to what I could feel. The shift in the air was still there, the slight drop in temperature, the compression of sound, but it had deepened. The boundary I had crossed the day before felt less like a threshold now and more like a gradient, something that extended outward rather than existing as a single point. As I moved closer, I became aware of something else. The devices. Now that I had recognized the first one, the others became easier to see, because I knew what to look for. Subtle interruptions in the natural patterns of bark and shadow, surfaces that absorbed light differently, shapes that held their position too precisely against the irregular lines of the trees. There were more of them now. Or perhaps there always had been. Either way, they were no longer limited to the deeper edge of the clearing. They extended inward, closer to the house, positioned at intervals that suggested coverage rather than placement. A network. Not dense, but complete. I stopped a few steps short of where I had entered the day before and turned slowly, mapping their positions relative to one another. Each device maintained the same behavior as the first, orientation defined by me rather than by any fixed axis. As I shifted, they adjusted, their attention aligning without visible movement. It wasn't invasive or aggressive. It was thorough. "You're expanding," I said quietly. The words felt less like speculation and more like confirmation. There was no immediate response, but the awareness of being observed intensified, not in pressure, but in clarity. Whatever system was operating here was no longer simply reacting to my presence, it was incorporating it. I stepped fully into the clearing again. This time, the sense of registration came faster, cleaner, less ambiguous. I didn't pause to examine the ground or the edges of the cut vegetation. Instead, I moved deeper into the space, testing how far the effect extended. With each step, the same subtle shift in perception followed. Sound flattening, distance compressing, the environment aligning itself in a way that felt less natural and more corrected. Halfway to the center, I stopped. Not because I had reached a limit, but because something else had drawn my attention. Movement. Not in the clearing itself, but beyond it, in the darker line of trees that marked the beginning of the denser forest. At first, it was nothing more than a suggestion, a slight inconsistency in the way the vertical lines of the trunks held against one another. The kind of thing you might dismiss if you weren't really looking for it. I shifted my position slightly, trying to isolate the source. The movement stopped. That, more than anything, made it noticeable. Natural motion carries through. Wind doesn't stop because you notice it. Animals don't freeze without a reason. This was not either of those. I waited. The clearing remained still around me, the devices maintaining their quiet alignment, their attention fixed. Then the movement returned, slow and measured, not crossing from one point to another, but adjusting within a space, as though something were repositioning itself without leaving the area it occupied. I narrowed my focus, letting the rest of the environment fall away until all that remained was the narrow section of forest where the inconsistency had appeared. That's when I realized something else. The devices weren't tracking it. Every visible unit remained oriented toward me, maintaining the same precise alignment they had held since I entered the clearing. There was no shift, no recalibration, no indication that whatever I was seeing had registered within the system at all. I turned slightly, testing the assumption. The devices followed me. Not the movement beyond the clearing's edge. Me. Interesting, I said under my breath. The word felt insufficient, but accurate. If the system could track me with this level of precision, then the absence of response to that movement wasn't a limitation. It was a choice. I took a step toward the edge of the clearing. The movement in the trees deepened. Not faster or larger, just more present. The vertical line I'd been watching began to resolve into something that almost suggested form. Not a figure, not in any way that could be clearly defined, but an interruption in the pattern that held its position even as my perspective shifted. I moved to the left, then to the right, trying to force parallax, trying to separate foreground from background. The shape didn't behave correctly. It didn't move independently of the trees, but it didn't remain fixed to them either. It seemed to exist within the space rather than in front of or behind it, an absence of consistency rather than the presence of form. I felt my focus tighten, not out of fear, but out of recognition. "This isn't part of you," I said. Every device in the clearing shifted, not gradually, not with any visible transition. One moment they were aligned with me, the next, they weren't. The collective attention of the system reoriented toward the same section of forest I had been watching. The effect was instantaneous and absolute, as though a single command had been issued across the entire network. The air changed with it. The pressure I had felt before, the subtle awareness of observation, tightened into something more focused, more specific. It wasn't directed at me anymore. It was directed outward. At the same point, the shape in the trees held for a fraction of a second longer. Then it was gone. Gone in a way that left no residual indication that it had ever been there. The trees returned to their original alignment. The depth corrected. The inconsistency vanished. And for a moment, nothing moved. Then, just as abruptly as it had shifted away from me, the system returned its attention. The devices realigned. The air relaxed. The clearing resumed its prior state as though the interruption had been acknowledged and dismissed. I remained where I was, letting the sequence settle into something I could understand. The system was capable of tracking more than just my movement. It could respond collectively. It could prioritize. And whatever I had seen, it had recognized as something requiring its attention. I turned slowly, taking in the full span of the clearing again. the house behind me, the devices embedded in the trees, the now still forest beyond. This wasn't random. It wasn't malfunction. It was structured. A process with parameters I was only beginning to understand. I exhaled slowly, letting the last of the tension leave my shoulders. "All right," I said. The word felt different this time. Not tentative, not reactive. It carried the weight of a decision. I stepped forward again, moving deeper into the clearing, past the point where I had stopped before, and to the center of the space that had been shaped so precisely around me. I didn't move once I got there. I stood still, waiting. It didn't take long. A faint light flickered high in the trees, subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. It pulsed once, then again, its rhythm slow and controlled. I raised my hand slightly, shielding my eyes as I readjusted my focus. The light responded, not by moving, by aligning. It tracked the angle of my hand, adjusting its intensity in a way that suggested calibration rather than illumination. I lowered my hand. The light dimmed, paused, then pulsed once more. The meaning wasn't clear, but it was enough. Acknowledgement. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a sense of confirmation that settled deeper than anything I had felt so far. "I see you," I said. The words felt unnecessary. The system already knew. The light pulsed again. Behind me, from somewhere inside the house, I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a door opening. I froze. I didn't turn around. Not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I understood what this moment represented. Up to this point, the interaction had been external. Observation and response. Input and output. Now, it was extending inward. I stood there for a moment longer, the clearing quiet around me, the system attentive in a way that no longer felt passive. Then I turned and walked back to the house. Chapter 5. Escalation. The storm started right after sundown. It didn't build the way storms usually do. There was no gradual thickening of clouds, no distant thunder to mark its approach. The air shifted first, subtly but unmistakably. The stillness that had settled over the clearing in the days after my visit to the library tightened into something more compressed, as though the space itself were holding tension without releasing it. By the time I noticed the sky had darkened, it was already too late to track when the change had begun. The first crack of thunder was deafening. It split the air directly overhead, sharp enough to feel physical, followed immediately by a sheet of rain that struck the roof and windows with sudden, overwhelming force. The forest reacted all at once. Branches bent, leaves turned, the layered structure of the trees collapsing into motion as wind drove through them in long, uneven surges. The clearing behind the house filled with shifting light, flashes of bright white that erased depth and replaced it with something flat and immediate. I stood at the window watching. For a fraction of the second, during one of the brighter strikes, the entire clearing was illuminated with a clarity that the daylight had never quite achieved. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The ground wasn't uniform. It carried a pattern. Not natural variation, not the irregularity of roots or stones beneath the surface. Lines. Straight. Intersecting. Arranged in a way that suggested measurement rather than chance. Then the light collapsed again, leaving the impression behind without enough time to confirm it. The power went out a moment later. Not with a flicker or gradual loss, but instantly. The low, constant hum of the house, the refrigerator, the ventilation system, the subtle electrical presence that underlies every modern space, disappeared, all at once. What remained was the storm, and yet the quiet was still there beneath it. I didn't move immediately. I let the darkness settle, let my eyes adjust, let the absence of artificial light define the room in a way that felt unfamiliar after days of the usual illumination. Then slowly something else took its place. There was a faint glow. I turned, tracking it as my eyes adjusted in the darkness. Something had emerged from the surface of the wall near the kitchen, surrounded by a thin line of pale blue light. It was the same type of device I had seen outside. It had incredible camouflage, and it was in the same impossible orientation that resisted being fixed in a single direction. I was sure it hadn't been there before. But then maybe it had, and I hadn't been able to see it. The realization didn't arrive so much as a shock as a correction in my thought pattern. That's when I started to notice others. They weren't clustered in one place, or even really hidden. They were distributed with intention, set into corners, near the ceiling, along the length of the room. They were placed in positions that blended so completely with the structure of the house itself that they had never been noticeable. Something tightened in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a sharp, immediate rejection of the idea that I had been moving through this space under that level of observation without realizing it. The house, which had finally begun to feel predictable again, shifted back into something unstable. "No," I said. The word felt more like an attempt to reassert control than actual denial. I crossed the room and reached for the nearest device. Up close, it didn't look any different than it had before. No seams, no visible lens, no indication of how it was attached. I wrapped my hand around it and pulled, expecting resistance. But there was none. It came free too easily, the motion clean and uninterrupted, as though it had never been fixed to the wall in any way that required force to remove it. For a moment, that threw off the rhythm of what I had intended to do. I had expected effort, friction, something that would justify the impulse behind the action, but instead it simply detached. Behind it was an empty space, glowing blue. I turned and threw the device across the room. It struck the wall and dropped to the floor, landing without the sharp break or scatter I would have expected from something mechanical. It didn't crack open. It didn't split. It just came to rest. I moved to the next one. This time I didn't hesitate. I pulled it free, then another, and another, dragging a chair into position so I could reach the one set higher along the wall. The sound of the chair scraping across the floor cut through the quiet of the house in a way that felt almost disruptive, bringing more chaos into something that had once been kept controlled. Each device came free with the same unnatural ease, as though the act of removing them had been already accounted for. Each one of them had the same space of glowing blue light behind it. I began to move faster, not concerned with where I was placing them, more focused on the act itself. The motion became repetitive. Reach, pull, drop, until the walls that had felt so quietly occupied only moments before began to look empty again. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I stopped and looked slowly around the room, breathing harder than I had expected. The house didn't seem to react. The system didn't escalate. There was no shift in the air, no increase in pressure, no indication that I had interrupted anything meaningful. The absence of response is what finally slowed me down. I stood there panting in the faint glow coming from the dozens of holes in the walls. The devices lay scattered across the floor in loose, uneven positions, their surfaces dark, indistinct from one another now that they were no longer embedded in the walls. For a moment, I let myself believe that I had done something. Not enough to stop it, but maybe enough to disrupt it. Then, one of them moved. The shift was small, almost imperceptible. The kind of change that could have been dismissed if I hadn't already been watching for it. It didn't roll or slide across the floor. It adjusted its orientation. Toward me. Another followed, then a third, and then every one of the devices aligned with me. That's when I knew this wasn't something that could be interrupted through force. It was built in a way that had planned ahead for that kind of failure. The system hadn't resisted what I had done, and in its allowance, something else became clear. I looked around the room again, at the empty sections of wall, at the devices on the floor, at the space that could no longer pretend to be neutral. "You wanted to see what I'd do," I said. My words felt steady again, grounded in something that had shifted from blind reaction into understanding. The system gave no visible response, no light or sound to show it had heard me. And yet the atmosphere of the room changed in that same subtle way I had felt before, the sense of attention narrowing just slightly, as though something had reacted and reached a conclusion. I exhaled, the tension easing in a way that felt less like relief and more like resolution. "All right," I said. "Bring it on." A sound came from upstairs. A door. Opening. I didn't hesitate. I moved toward the staircase. The soft light of 100 more cameras followed me from points along the walls. Each device contributed just enough illumination to maintain visibility without fully revealing the space. The effect was ethereal. At the top of the stairs, the hallway held its shape, but something about it felt compressed, as though the distance between each door had been reduced without anything visibly moving. The guest room door at the far end stood open. I was certain I had closed it earlier. I walked toward it slowly, aware of a subtle pressure gathering ahead of me. It wasn't enough to stop me, but it was present in a way that made the space feel expectant, as if the room had been prepared before I reached it. Halfway down the hall, I paused. There was movement inside. Something adjusting. The same way I had seen beyond the clearing. I continued forward. At the threshold, I stopped. The room appeared normal at first glance. The bed was in place, the chair near the wall untouched, the window catching intermittent flashes of lightning from the storm outside. But the longer I looked, the less stable that impression became. The walls didn't meet correctly. The corners held, but only loosely, as though the angles had been reconstructed and never fully locked into place. Lines that should have been straight drifted slightly off, forcing my eyes to correct them. Then something on the far wall changed. A section of it shifted inward, almost silently, not opening like a door, separating. A rectangular seam of blue light revealed itself where there hadn't been one before, and a panel recessed into the wall, exposing a surface behind it. A screen. The devices in the room reacted immediately. Light pulsed across them in a controlled sequence. It was the same Morse code pattern I had seen before. Stay. I stepped inside. The air felt denser, as though the room were holding more than it should. The screen flickered once, not with static, but with a kind of recalibration, as if it were adjusting to my presence. Then the screen brightened, and text began to appear as if someone was typing. Pattern recognition confirmed. Response variability within acceptable range. Adaptive behavior verified. The screen cleared, then filled again with text. Candidate status approved. Prepare for transition. Personal effects minimal. Time frame next cycle. I felt my breathing steady, not because the information was exactly reassuring, but because it was final. The final line took longer to appear, and when it did, it stayed longer than all the others too. Be outside by 10 a.m. tomorrow. The storm cracked overhead again, lightning flooding the room with white light. For a moment, the screen washed out completely, the words disappearing into brightness. When the light receded, the text was still there, unchanged, waiting. I stood there longer than I had intended to, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I did. This wasn't a warning or a threat. These were instructions. I looked around the room once more. The walls, the devices, the panel that had opened without sound, and realized that nothing about this moment felt uncertain anymore. There was no distortion left. Everything had resolved into purpose. The system had been measuring, and now it was moving forward. All right, I said quietly. The screen dimmed slightly, not turning off, but withdrawing its focus as though the exchange had been completed. The panel slid back into place, sealing seamlessly into the wall. The room corrected itself. The corners aligned. The pressure eased. By the time I stepped back into the hallway, it had already begun to feel like an ordinary space again. I looked toward the living room windows. The rain was falling more lightly now, the flashes of lightning spaced farther apart as the storm moved off. In the brief illuminations, I could just make out the clearing. That's when the message upstairs settled into something more complete. Prepare for transition. Be outside by 10 a.m. tomorrow. You've already decided, I said, not expecting a response. Behind me, one of the devices emitted a brief pulse of light. It felt like a quiet confirmation. I settled at the window a while longer, aware of how little resistance I felt now compared to when I had started this. The instinct to question, to interrupt, to test the edges of what was happening hadn't disappeared entirely, but no longer held the same urgency. Because the process I had been reacting to was no longer waiting for me to understand it. It had already reached its conclusion. I stepped back from the glass and turned away, the house settling into quiet behind me. Whatever it was, it had moved past observation, and it was taking me with it. The house felt smaller once I started packing, not in any way that I could measure. The rooms held their shape, the walls remained where they should have been, and the quiet still settled into each space with the same steady consistency. But something about it had changed. The sense of expansion I had noticed when I first arrived, the way the space seemed to stretch just beyond its physical limits, was gone. Everything felt proportionate now. I moved through the house without hesitation, selecting only what felt necessary. The instructions had been clear enough. Personal effects, minimal. And I found that I didn't question it. There was no impulse to take more, no lingering attachment to anything I left behind. Each decision came easily, as though the importance of each object had already been reduced to something simple and manageable. Clothing, documents, my phone. Everything else stayed. The kitchen was the last room that I passed through. I paused there briefly, my attention drifting to the counter where I first had noticed the disturbance in the dust, where the notification had appeared, where the process had first made itself visible in a way that I couldn't ignore. There was nothing there now, no trace of what had happened, and that absence didn't unsettle me. I carried the bag to the front door and set it beside it, then rested my hand against the wood for a moment longer. The instruction had been specific. Be outside. Not leave, not go, just be there. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The clearing stretched out in front of me, unchanged. The ground no longer showed the grid I had traced the night before, but I could still feel its structure in the spacing, and the way the air seemed to hold its shape without visible lines. The trees stood back. The space between them remained stable. Nothing moved, nothing adjusted. Whatever had been active there had already completed its work. I stepped down from the porch and walked along the edge of the clearing, stopping where the pattern had once been most visible. The air felt ordinary now. No pressure, no distortion, but the awareness hadn't left. The sound reached me before the vehicle appeared. A low, steady hum drifted through the trees, growing gradually louder until it became clear that it belonged to something moving along the narrow road leading toward the property. I walked back toward the house and set my bag down beside the porch steps to wait. The vehicle emerged from the trees a few moments later. At first glance, it looked like an old station wagon that should have been sitting behind a repair shop somewhere. The paint had faded unevenly over the years, and small dents marked the body in places where time had won minor arguments. But the sound coming from it didn't match its appearance. There was no engine noise, no vibration, just a smooth electric hum that seemed almost too quiet for something moving over gravel. The station wagon rolled into the driveway and stopped. The driver's window was already down. The woman behind the wheel leaned an elbow on the door and looked up at me through oversized sunglasses. She smiled comfortably, like she already knew where she was. "You here to pick me up?" I asked. She nodded once. "Okay." I glanced around at the back seat of the car. "You know where you're taking me?" Her smile widened slightly.
Sure.
That was all she offered. Not rude, not secretive. Simply unconcerned with providing additional information. She looked toward the tree line briefly, then back at me.
They did a nice job with this one.
I followed her gaze. The clearing stretched farther than it had when I'd first arrived. "What is it?" I asked. The woman shrugged.
Above my pay grade.
The answer sounded rehearsed, like she'd said it before, a lot. She tilted her head toward the back seat.
Got what you need?
I looked down at the single bag sitting beside me. I think so.
Far out, soul sister. Welcome to the family. Buckle up. We've got a long ride down the probability curve, and reality's feeling especially flexible today.
The phrase landed strangely, not because of the words themselves, but because she seemed completely serious. She pushed her sunglasses up slightly and smiled again.
You got a name?
I paused, looking back toward the house, and felt the last of my uncertainty finally settle. Whatever was waiting at the end of this adventure had been there since long before I arrived in Marrow Creek, and despite everything that had happened, I knew I was going to meet it, head on, honestly, and without fear. Yeah, my name is Marla.
The clearing and the house still remain. Whether the observation ever truly ended is unknown. This was The Cleared Line, brought to you by KillerPrompt. If you enjoyed this story, consider following along for more original horror, mysteries, and strange encounters from places that may be closer than they appear. Want the full files? Patreon gets early stories, exclusive universe drops, behind-the-scene content, hidden lore documents, and access to the darker corners of KillerPrompt. Until next time, the line has been cleared, the boundary has been crossed. We'll see you at the next story.